So we're going to go, I'm going to just dive right in because I have a lot to share. If you, many of you have heard me speak before, and you know that I don't err on the side of too little content. But I'm going to trust that because this is recorded, if it seems like it's too much, you can get access to it afterward and go back through. So the topic is kind of unusual, I think, the holy relics. This is an imagination on the planet Mars and Parzival's quest for the Holy Grail. And so I'm going to give you a brief description of how I got to this, but I'd also like to take a moment, a quiet moment perhaps, and dedicate tonight's talk to Fred Janney and to his family, and also to honor the community and the space in community that is left open by his crossing over the threshold, and that space may be filled with peace and warmth and joy. So if we could just take a moment and think of Fred. And if you did not know Fred Janney, then this is the moment when it's appropriate to think of loved ones who have died. Okay, I'm going to have a little bit more to say about Fred at the end of our talk, but just wanted to start in that space. So how I got to this topic for this month was through both the Wolfram von Eschenbach's version of the legend of Parzival and Walter Johannes Stein's book on the 9th century and the Holy Grail. And in reading Stein's book, he gives a description of a festival that was established, or rather a feast that was established in the 9th century of the Holy Relics. And he's, in the first part of this book, is establishing what I think is a historical precedent for the legend of Parzival. So looking historically to see who are the characters, were there actual historical figures that were living, and are they the ones on whom Wolfram von Eschenbach and perhaps Chrétien de Troyes, were they actually talking about real people? And so I'm going to just briefly go through the location where he's doing most of this research, which is in Reichenau in Germany. And there on the island of Reichenau, there's the Cathedral of St. Mary and Mark, where there are these holy relics. So perhaps the most popular there, at least from the research that I could do. I haven't been there, although I got to speak with Rosemary Caruso yesterday, and she has been there several times, that some of the most notable relics that are there at Reichenau are the bones of St. Mark the Evangelist, the Holy Blood relic, which I've read two different descriptions. One is either that it is the blood-soaked soil that was from the foot of the cross, or it's also the first blood that was shed at the ceremony of the circumcision of the Christ child. And then there's a picture from the wedding at Cana of Galilee. So I'm not going to develop this part of what we're doing, but I just want to point out that there's a festival that happens every year. Actually, I think they have a festivals 3 times a year about these relics. But according to Walter Johannes Stein, the festival was first established in the 9th century, and it was to honor the fact that this blood relic had come to the island of Reichenau, and that it was to be honored every single year because of the grace and the wonder and the sense of holiness that it brought to that location. And so there's a feast of the Holy Relics that happens each year in November. And it usually falls within the octave of All Saints' Day. This year, I believe it was on the 5th of November. I couldn't find information about why it's a movable feast. I don't know if it's just because it needs to fall on a certain day of the week. But just to say that this is something that is ongoing, and that I'm not going to talk about making the things of the elements of anthroposophy into relics, but just to say that this was something I was reading in Stein, and I thought, it's really fascinating that we have something sacred in our striving to understand ourselves as spiritual beings, as human beings, and that there can be these elements that carry a quality that give us a sense of connecting not only to community but to the spiritual world, and that they sometimes can manifest physically for us, such as what's happening at the island of Reichenau. But then also, I had been studying last year Rudolf Steiner's book, his information on the Christ in the spiritual world and the search for the Holy Grail. And he gives a very personal account in those lectures about his own researching of the Grail legend. And it's one of those lectures where it just, you feel like you're just sitting down with him and having a conversation. But he describes how, as he was seeking information about the Grail, he would kind of lose the stream of it, but then find it again. And at a certain point, he describes having been as though admonished that he needed to look for where he would see the name of the hero Parzival in the legend. And what he describes is that he was led to see the name of Parzival in this unique situation that can sometimes happen with the moon, which is when the moon will appear usually when it's at its waning crescent phase. So it's just a few days before it's exactly new. So this would be looking in the east, and we see the sliver of the crescent moon, and it looks like the new moon is sitting in the lit up part of the moon that's waning. And so you could say that this is like a Grail moon. And what Rudolf Steiner describes in this lecture is that he realized that it is there on that shining sliver of crescent moon that is where the name of Parzival appears. And I'll just read out this quote. Where then is the Grail, which today must be found in such a way that the name of Parzival stands upon it? Where can it be found? Now, in the course of my researches, it had been shown to me that the name, that is the first thing, must be sought for in the stellar script. And then, on a day which I must regard as specially significant for me, I was shown where the gold gleaming vessel in its reality is to be found, so that through its symbolical expression in the stellar script, we are led to the secret of the Grail. And then I saw in the stellar script something that anyone can see, only he will not immediately discern the secret. So he goes on in this lecture to describe this mystery of this particular type of moon, which is that it appears as though the sunlight is only shining on that little crescent sliver, but the moon doesn't really have I'll call it a capacity to prevent being penetrated by the sunlight. And that what we're actually seeing in the unillumined part of the moon is the spiritualized sun. And so you can imagine that this sliver of the moon that is lit up is like a chalice with the host sitting in it. And so this begins to be a sacred picture that's appearing in the starry, in the sky, that has this strong symbolic relationship to the Grail. So when you look into the sky this week, so today's the 10th, so in 2 days, if you've got clear skies in the morning, you'll see the waning crescent moon. This is looking east about half an hour before sunrise. And on the 12th, it will be approaching Venus. And then the very next morning, which is Friday the 13th, it will be just past Venus. So not only is it possible to see the moon with the light on it and the host of the new moon sitting in it, but when it comes close to Venus as morning star, this also presents a really unique relationship to the Parzival story that I'm going to describe a little bit more later on. But I just want to point out that I think it's just this awesome mystery that the moon will only ever go by the planet Venus when it's in its crescent phase. We'll never see the moon as a gibbous. We'll never see the moon at its full phase next to the planet Venus, because Venus can only ever be morning star or evening star, which means that the moon is either a waxing crescent or a waning crescent when it passes by the goddess of love and beauty. And there's some exchange taking place between these celestial bodies in that gesture, in that the moon will only ever visit Venus when it's in this chalice phase where it's carrying the host. So this is something to keep in mind that I'm going to get to more thoroughly afterward, but this is just to set up about how I'm getting to what the idea is that I want to be sharing tonight. Now, recently, Venus and Mars, well, just yesterday morning, Venus and Mars were exactly opposite one another in the sky. And this image that I'm showing on the right comes from the Michigan State University Abrams Planetarium. And what I want you to see is that the planet Mars is really, really high up in the southeast at about 9 o'clock these nights, and then it's gradually moving over toward the west. I'm pointing this way because that's west for me. But so we're seeing Mars, well, Saturn and Jupiter are both still up in the evening sky, and then we've got Mars high up, and then they begin to set. And just yesterday morning, Mars was exactly opposite Venus. So as Venus was rising in the east, Mars was setting in the west. And so there's a certain encounter that they're having, not when they're together, but when they're standing on opposite sides of the starry heaven, that is as though a strengthening of the soul language. So Rudolf Steiner speaks about the relationship between Venus and Mars in his lectures on the individualities of the planets. And he describes how Venus is looking deeply into the heart of the human being and is not interested in what's happening in the celestial cosmos around her, except for the utterances of Mars. And then he also says that it's when they're in square to one another, or when they have what would astrologically maybe be described as a challenging aspect, that what passes between them can actually bring a strengthening to the soul quality of the language. And so I just want to point out that Venus and Mars are very, for me, really significant in the story that's going on in the sky right now, especially because I'm allowing myself to imagine that Mars, the red planet, is actually the red knight Parzival. So very quickly into the story of Parzival, he becomes the red knight. He slays the knight Ither and takes his armor. And then Venus, I would imagine, as Siguna, who is his cousin. And so Venus Siguna is the one that gives Parzival his names. They have 3 significant encounters in the legend, and Venus and Mars are making at least 3 significant encounters in this last quarter of 2020. So all of this kind of building toward how I got here. So it's reading the legend of Parzival, studying Walter Johannes Stein, looking at what Rudolf Steiner has to say about the search for the Holy Grail and how we can find this legend scripted in the starry skies, and also specifically with the crescent moon, which right now is going to be passing by Venus while Mars is standing opposite them. All right, so now here's the first cascade where we're going to ask you to go to the chat. So everybody open up the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And then what I want you to do, without pressing send, type in how you came first to anthroposophy, or the moment that you realized that anthroposophy was your path, or a path that you were going to spend your time researching in life. So go to the chat and type that, and then I'm going to count to 3, and on the count of 3, we will all press send so that it will cascade down so that we can all see, and we'll take a moment to look at everyone's description. It can be very brief, about the moment that you realized that anthroposophy was a path for you. And so give everybody just a moment to do that, and then I'll count to 3. Maybe Jane, you can let me know if you had enough time. Okay. All right, so on the count of 3, then everybody press send. All right, so that was how we got here. And I called this spirit recalling. Should call to mind the foundation stone meditation. All right, so now I want to describe what's happening with Parzival, because I have this imagination that in October, when the planet Mars came as close to the Earth as it came really, really close in 2003, but this year it came almost as close. And it doesn't always do that. Mars, every 2 years, will make a retrograde motion where it appears to us that it's going in the opposite direction than we normally see it. And when it does that, it kind of makes a loop that causes it to swing very close to the Earth, and it will appear brighter and brighter. And this year it got even brighter than the planet Jupiter, which is unusual. Usually the order of brightness in objects in our sky, it's Sun, Moon, Venus, and then Jupiter. But this year it was Sun, Moon, Venus, Mars. So remembering, I'm thinking of Mars as Parzival and Venus as Siguna, his cousin, who's the one that gives him his name. So what I imagine is that when Mars came close to the Earth, it was October 6th. It was as though, and Venus was in the morning sky with the crescent moon. I imagine this as the first meeting between Parzival and Siguna. And she's there, she has Shanatalander in her lap. This is her beloved who has been slain in a joust. He has gone off chasing after the hound Gardavias, who wears a collar that has a leash on it. And on the collar and the leash is embedded in jewels this message from a king that he has sent off to his beloved that is written as though in a starry script. And Siguna has been reading this, but the hound has gotten away from her. So she tells her beloved Shanatalander that she'll only marry him if he can bring the hound back to her, and very much abbreviating the story. But what happens is he goes out after the hound, he ends up in a joust with Aurelius, and he's slain. So when Parzival comes upon her, she's there with her beloved in her lap, and he offers to help her to bury him. And she begins to speak to him, and she asks him who he is. And he doesn't, at this point, he does not know his name. And so she is able to, when she hears him speak, she recognizes his description of himself and realizes that she knows him. His mother, Herzeloida, is actually her aunt. And so she knows that his name is Parzival, and she gives him his name. So there's a really beautiful mystery happening in this, that the one that can read the starry script is the one that can give you the name. And also how Rudolf Steiner is describing that to find the name of Parzival, one must be able to read the starry script. So I imagine that on October 6th, when Mars was kind of very, very close to the Earth and Venus, Siguna, was in the morning sky, it was as though this moment when Mars received his name. So Parzival receives his name, and then he goes off looking very red in the sky, like the Red Knight, and he makes his first journey to the Mont Salvêche, the Grail castle. Now, when he gets there, I'm really abbreviating the story, but he gets there, and as you know, he's been told not to ask questions by Gurnemanz, and he is obeying this kind of social decorum that really isn't appropriate to the spiritual mystery that he's witnessing, because he really wonders what's going on, but he doesn't ask the question. All right, so I'm going to just read this part of the legend about how then Anfortas, then the Grail king, gives him the sword. And he thought, Gurnemanz, he bade me in truth, without thought of guile, to withhold my lips from question, if here I abide a while. Methinks it will then befall me, as aforetime in Greyhar's land, they will tell me, without my question, how here with this folk it stands. Then e'en as he sat thus musing, came a squire who a sword did bear, and its sheath was 1,000 marks worth, and its hilt was a ruby rare. And the blade it might well work wonders. Then the host gave it to the knight, and he spake, I full oft have borne it in many a deadly fight. Ere God's hand thus sorely smote me, now with this shalt thou be repaid. If aught hath in care been lacking, henceforth shalt thou bear this blade. Whatever chance befall thee, and when thou its power hast tried, thou wilt know thou art fully armed, whatever strife betide. So this is a really important moment in the legend of Parzival, where he's given the Grail sword. He's at the Grail castle. He hasn't asked any questions about all of the wonders that he's witnessing there. He recognizes that the king is suffering. He recognizes the wailing of all of the knights and this great ceremony that's happening. And he's even given this sacred sword, but he doesn't ask the question. He doesn't ask, why is he given the sword? He doesn't ask why the king is suffering. He doesn't ask anything about what he's seeing in the space. Woe unto Parzival. So now what does Parzival do with this sword? So he goes to sleep that night, and when he gets up in the morning, everyone has gone from the castle, and he thinks, well, maybe they've gone out hunting, and I will go show them that, last night things didn't go so well. It was kind of awkward. I didn't really understand what was happening, and if I can meet everybody out in the forest, then I can show them that I'm a brave hunter. But of course, he follows the foot markings of the horses and the soldiers that are walking, and pretty soon it's dispersed and he can't find his way. So he realizes that he's lost, he can't find anyone, and then he comes upon Siguna a second time. Okay, so remember, I'm imagining the first Mars coming very close to the Earth is Mars getting his name from Siguna. He goes on, he's into the Grail castle, and now we come to the second meeting of Mars with Venus, which just happened yesterday morning. And this is what I'm imagining as the second meeting of Parzival with Siguna. And so she sees him and she says, then she spake, if e'er joy befall me, that shall be when I know relief is his, who so long has suffered, when is lightened his load of grief. If through thee he hath found this succor, then in truth shall all praise be thine. Methinketh e'en now at thy girdle do I see his sword shine. So Siguna sees him and she's like, you've got the sword, you must have been at the castle. So bear with me, this is all going to come together in a moment. And then she goes on to say, you know, if you've been given this sword, then you need to know, you would have been given the secret charm that's kind of engraved on the side of this sword, so that you need to know the mystery of it and how to use it. And I'm going to read this part out because I think this is particularly important. If its magic spell thou knowest, then to strife mayest thou fearless fare. For its edge is keen, its maker a noble name doth bear. Trebuchet's hand hath wrought it, by Carnet there flows a spring, and lack from the name of that streamlet, methinks is he named the king. The sword will withstand the first blow, at the next it will break in twain, and thou to these waters bring it, from their flow 'twill be whole again. Yet where at its source the streamlet flows forth from its rocky bed, shalt thou seek those healing waters, ere the sun stand high overhead. Locke is the name of that fountain. If unsplintered shall be the blade, then press thou its halves together, from the waters shall it be made. Not whole alone, but stronger, the blade and the edge shall grow, nor their brightness and fair adorning be dimmed by the water's flow. So she's telling him, all right, I see you've got the sword, and here's what you need to know about it. You can use this sword, the first blow it will be very strong, at the second strike it can splinter, in which case you need to take it to this sacred source, to this well that's by a rock in the place that's not illumined by the sun. And if you place it at the water there, at that source of inspiration, not only will it be made whole, but it will be made stronger. Yet a spell thou first must master, ere thou draw that sword of might. Then thou hast left it behind, I fear me. Hast thou learned its word aright? Then in truth all earthly blessings shall blossom and bear for thee. Believe me, dear my cousin, what of marvels thou there couldst see. To thine hand shall they all do service, the crown of blessings fair, uplifted o'er all earth's noblest, henceforward thine head shall bear. And thine is desire's fulfillment, and none with thy wealth and might may measure himself, if the question hath won at thy lips its right. So now she's saying, here's all the glory that will be yours if you ask the question. And so Parzival has to confess to her that he did not ask the question. So this is this really critical moment where Parzival and Siguna, or you could say Mars and Venus, are having this encounter where he's starting to become aware. First, he knows his name, like he recognizes, I would say, that he's on a particular path once the name is spoken, but he still is not conscious of all the pieces that belong to that and his role and his destiny in it. And he's not to be faulted for this lack of awareness. He's been raised very specifically so that he wouldn't know certain things. His mother was trying to protect him from knighthood because she lost his father in a joust, and she didn't want that to happen to her son. But it's very interesting what Rudolf Steiner then says about the legend of Parzival, which is that it's when we this questing for the Holy Grail has to do with what he describes as the path of anthroposophy, specifically through his book Occult Science, where he describes that the hidden knowledge that he's been explaining in this book, that it's something that is gradually taking hold of mankind and will increasingly, I gotta bear with me because my screen, it puts everybody over the text so that I can't read it. I'm gonna do this. The hidden knowledge that is gradually taking hold of mankind and will increasingly be doing so may, in the language of a well-known symbol, be called the knowledge of the Grail. We read of the Holy Grail in old-time narratives and legends, and as we learn to understand its deeper meaning, we discover that it most significantly pictures the heart and essence of the new initiation knowledge, centering on the mystery of Christ. The initiates of the New Age may therefore be described as the initiates of the Grail. So this comes from occult science in the section on the present and future evolution of the world and mankind. So in the beginning, I asked us to share how we came to anthroposophy, how we recognized that this was a path that we are going to take. And now I'm saying to us that Rudolf Steiner says in occult science that this particular path is actually a Grail path. And so we could imagine ourselves, each of us, as Parzival on this path, and that perhaps choosing anthroposophy as the life path, or even just as the contemplative path or the research and the study, is as though this moment when you hear your name spoken. There's a mystery that calls when something awakens and you say, that is the thing that interests me. So what is that moment? It was perhaps that I heard about Waldorf education for my child, or I was given a book, or I was taken to a lecture, or something occurred that stirred something in me. This is this moment that I would say is the first encounter between Parzival and Siguna, where she tells him his name. And then we go on along this path, and certain mysteries are revealed to us, but we don't fully recognize all of it all at once. It's not possible to have that level of consciousness. And it's not that we err by not knowing it all at once, but in the way this is, the analogy in the legend is that Parzival is, once he recognizes his name, he's admitted into the castle, but because he doesn't ask the appropriate question, he's given a piece of the Grail relics, you could call them. He's given the sword, but he doesn't even fully know what to do with it until the second encounter with Siguna. And then she tells him, all right, you can use this sword. At the first strike, it will be very strong, but the second time, it can break. And then you need to know how to get to the place, to the source, where you can weld it back together if you know the sacred words. And then she realizes he didn't ask the question. So he's got a piece of it. And I imagine that when we start out on a spiritual path, it's something has called us, something has spoken our kind of inner name. And then we begin this journey where we have the pieces of something. And when we come together in community, we find out that we might have pieces that overlap, or somebody has a piece that's standing on the exact opposite side. But when we come into community, it's as though the pieces are made whole. So I imagine that if we each have a piece like of this Grail sword, one fragment of it, that when we come together in community, it is as though we are welding it together, which makes it much stronger. Even when we have to be in an environment like online doing Zoom instead of coming together physically, so we can share ideas about how is it that I came to anthroposophy, and then the next question is going to be, what do I do with anthroposophy? But before we get there, I just want to describe what Rudolf Steiner had to say about this in Walter Johannes Stein's book. He's giving this description of Rudolf Steiner coming into his 11th grade classroom and saying, when Stein was teaching about Parzival, and Rudolf Steiner starts to speak with the students, and he says, you know, it's very important to pay attention that all true narrators of the Grail legend must begin at the same point, which is when they have the fragments of the sword, and they must appear by night beside the rock that is unillumined by the sunlight of waking consciousness. So this is exactly what Siguna has said to Parzival. Rudolf Steiner is describing this, that anyone who is on this journey, they have to recognize that they have a fragment of the sword, and they have to appear beside the rock that is unillumined by the sunlight of waking consciousness. Here, at the source of inspiration, at the well of Cunavare, the spiritual sword will again be made whole out of the fragments of lingering tradition. And now this is what I believe about what's living behind this. If I'm joining the legend of Parzival together with anthroposophy as a spiritual path, and I imagine that something is being scripted in the starry sky, and I try to imagine what is this rock? Where is this well? What is the sacred word that needs to be spoken? What is the sword? I am inviting you into my imagination that now we could imagine that the rock is actually the foundation stone, and that the foundation stone was laid into the earth at the hill on Dornoch in 1913, but then also at the Christmas conference, 1923 to 24. It was laid into the hearts of the human being, and it would live in the hearts of all those who choose anthroposophy as their path, and that within the heart is the unillumined place, because the inner nature of the human being is only illuminated by our own spiritual light. So it's very specific that you have to come to the rock that is unillumined by the sunlight of waking consciousness. So it's not the daylight that brings the light that illuminates this, but our own spiritual striving that illuminates this rock, this foundation stone that has been laid into the heart. And the stream that is springing from the source where this rock is, I imagine to be anthroposophy. So the stream of anthroposophy, you could say, is this is the source of inspiration, and that the being that guards the well, Wolfram von Eschenbach describes her as Kunavare, but I'm allowing myself to imagine that the being that guards this source of inspiration is the being of Anthroposophia. So that if anthroposophy is a Grail path, each of us are Parzival, then we have this opportunity to look within the heart where the foundation stone lives as an inspiration, and that the striving to understand the true nature of being human through anthroposophy allows that to become illumined, and that the inspiration that we receive for that illumination is coming from a striving to know anthroposophy, and that this is engagement with the being of Anthroposophia. Okay, so that for me then says that it is our individual initiatives within anthroposophy that are the fragments of the sword, which are made whole when we come together in community. So if each of us, having in the first cascade shared how is it that we came to anthroposophy, would now take a moment to consider, and what do I do with anthroposophy in my life? And it doesn't have to be something that I do professionally, but just I have anthroposophy in my life, and then what do I do with that? How am I as Parzival in the world, recognizing that I carry the sword, or that I am a member of a community where we each have a piece of this sword, and when we come together and see one another, something starts to radiate from the heart that builds strength in that community. So, I'm sorry, I had one more quote from Rudolf Steiner. We see that the highest imaginable ideal of human evolution results from the knowledge of the Grail, the spiritualization that man acquires through his own efforts. So imagining that this foundation stone has been laid into our hearts, this is the rock, but beside which this stream of inspiration flows, which is the stream of anthroposophy. The being that guards that stream is Anthroposophia, and we are they who would come with the fragments of the sword together in community so that it could be welded together. And so now in the second cascade, if everybody would go to the chat again, and now what I want us to do is to answer this question, what do I do here with this anthroposophy? So I met it at a certain point in my past, which I described as the spirit recalling, and now the spirit sensing, which is how do I work with anthroposophy out into the world? And it may just be that I keep it to myself, and that I am that I use it as research. But so before you press send, let's give everybody a moment to type into the chat, and then we'll count down to 3, and then you'll press again. And I hope that you're not being confounded by this way of engaging, but trying to get us to be together in the space. Now on to the third. Now this section, what I want to do is describe what I'm seeing in the star picture. All right, so the first part was a little bit about how I got here. So by studying Wolfram von Eschenbach, reading Walter Johannes Stein, I actually also, 2 days into this book, went out into the woods and found a rusted shield leaning up against a tree on a forest path that I walk along a lot. And so just very coincidentally, it showed up. And a friend, I shared it with a friend, and he mentioned to me that he was trying to decide whether or not he should, what online course he should take. And because I saw that shield, he decided he would sign up for Brian Gray's 16-session course on the Holy Grail, so I dived in with him. So it's been, that shield that I found in the woods was like a portal into a very interesting experience that has very much informed what I'm seeing happening in the sky right now. If I allow myself to imagine Mars as Parzival and Venus as Saguna and what they're doing in the midst of all of the other things that are happening in the sky right now. So as I shared earlier, Mars came closest to the Earth on October 6th, and at that moment, the crescent moon, and that morning, the crescent moon was very close to Venus. And oftentimes, this encounter that Parzival has with Saguna, when he first sees her with Shanatalander in her lap, this is likened to the Pietà, where you can imagine that the chalice with the host in it is like the body and the blood of the Christ being, you could say, and then Venus becomes the Virgin that's holding this being in her lap. So that when Venus is the morning star, you could say that this is happening every month as the moon is waning through the morning sky when Venus is morning star. And remember, the moon will only ever go by Venus when it is at its crescent phase. But Mars is not going to always be standing opposite when that is going on, nor is Mars going to be positioned where it is, where it looks like it's been in the region of the stars of Pisces, but from the angle where I am, when it's setting in the west in the morning, Pisces is kind of already tipped over toward the horizon, and it looks like Aries is right above it. And I have learned through my study with Brian that Aries is likened when Parzival gets to the Grail castle. I am imagining that that's Mars near the stars of Aries. So Mars came to its opposition with the sun a few days later, which was then on October 13th. And then yesterday, Mars opposed Venus. Venus was in the morning sky and Mars in the west setting at that moment. And so I'm imagining that that's the second encounter. So the first encounter, Mars gets his name. That was in October. And now yesterday, Parzival Mars meets Saguna Venus again. And he's got the sword, but now he realizes that he hasn't asked the question. And so this is not necessarily a really exciting moment for him. He's got to make the commitment and the decision that he is going to take up the task of trying to understand what were the consequences of his being unconscious. All right, so tomorrow morning, actually the 12th and the 13th, we're going to see the crescent moon and Venus again. We also have at the same time Jupiter conjunct Pluto for the third and final time in 2020. We also have the peak of the Taurid meteor shower. And also we have Mars coming to its direct motion on Friday the 13th. Okay, sorry, I just put a lot of stuff up there, but I just want to say that this Venus moon, again, that I'm imagining this is as Saguna with Shanatalander in her lap. The second time Parzival encounters her, she still has the body of Shanatalander with her. So this is a very sacred moment where it's kind of a reversal of the first encounter that Parzival has with her. Then he goes to the Grail castle. He now has the sword. He comes back. He meets her again. And she reveals to him that what could be his if he had asked the question. But once he reveals to her that he doesn't, then she cuts off the conversation and that's it. So right at this time this week, where I'm imagining that this is going on, we had this meeting between the planet Jupiter and the now dwarf planet Pluto. And this has been, in a certain respect, you could say, been carrying the mood of what 2020 has been about. Jupiter is expansive, and it is usually associated through Greek mythology with Zeus. It's about the future. And Pluto is oftentimes likened to deep transformation. And so one of the ways I've heard this conjunction described is as a desire for massive social regeneration. And certainly at the beginning of the year, we were seeing a great deal of unrest that seems to be taking on, there's another chapter of it that seems to be occurring right now. But also we're at the peak of the northern Taurid meteor shower. And the constellation Taurus is the region that lends its name to this meteor shower. That constellation doesn't cause the shower, but the practice in the world of astronomy is to name a meteor shower according to the region from which the stars seem to fall through the sky. And again, through the course with Brian, I have learned that the Parzival legend actually begins when Parzival is setting out from, it's likened to the region of Taurus. And Taurus governs the larynx region of the human form. And so it has to do with speaking. And that Parzival will actually become not a warrior knight that's just going to go out and be like a soldier that's going to battle, but that he becomes a knight of the word, the sacred word. So in the second encounter with Venus Saguna that Mars had yesterday, then it's as though we're in this time now for the next few days while Mars is slowing down to begin its direct motion on Friday, that it's as though Parzival is making the decision now to take up his task and to right the wrongs that he has now become aware of. Now, at the same time, there's a comet that's just been discovered. It's not a naked eye comet yet, but it's kind of exciting because it looks like it could become. And it's known as Comet Erasmus, after the gentleman on the team that works with this particular telescope that discovered it. And right now, it's near the star Eta Crateris, which is in the constellation Crater, the Cup, which you could say is like the chalice. So I just think it's an interesting coincidence that we've got a comet in the crater, in the cup, at the same time that Mars is about to go direct. So when Mars is making his commitment, now that he's had his second encounter with Saguna. Then, now I'm skipping ahead to next month. We're going to see the waning crescent moon, in addition to being next to Venus this week, a month from now, that's going to happen again. And when that happens, what the trajectory is being calculated for the comet is that it's going to be right near the moon and Venus. But we probably won't be able to see it if it has brightened, because it will be in the morning hours. And so the sunlight will be too bright for it. But just knowing that there's a comet that's kind of whipping through this scene also, it's bringing a very interesting accent mark to this story. Then on the 14th of December, there's a total solar eclipse where the moon is going to pass directly in front of the sun. The shadow of that eclipse will not be visible from the United States. It's going to fall across Argentina. But what happens at that moment, whenever there is a total solar eclipse, one of the first things that happens is that the planet Venus, because it's so bright, becomes visible in daytime. And so I imagine when Venus is unveiled like that in the day, normally she's clothed with the sun, that when she's unveiled, it's as though it's like the birth of this feminine that is taking place. And so we have an opportunity at this time to make ready for that kind of an event. So I've only put up here the detail of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, but normally on the left side, you would see the Zephyrus blowing her to the shore. And then on the right side is one of the Horae, one of the hours. And she's there with a cloak to receive Venus once she's born. And so knowing ahead of time that we're going to have this experience where we won't be seeing the eclipse, but we can know that Venus is about to be unveiled on December 14th, you could do ceremony, you could do activity to prepare to receive that. You could imagine, again, that she's in her role as Saguna, that she is bearing a sacred task that includes sounding the name of the individual, the true name, because she's the one that can read the starry script, and also that she's the one that is able to give indication, at least to Parzival, that yes, here's what's possible, here's what's available to you, but only if you had been conscious enough. And now she's able to call forth in him conscience so that he can make a commitment to take up that path. And then she herself is going to be unveiled at this eclipse. And this is just a setup for some other really awesome things that are going to be happening in December. So the moon is going to be with Venus December 12th in the morning sky. Then it's going to eclipse the sun. Venus is going to be exposed in broad daylight. And then the moon is going to go by Jupiter and Saturn. After it's new, then it will be in the evening sky, and it will be a waxing crescent right next to Saturn and Jupiter, just a few days ahead of them coming to their great conjunction, which only happens once every 20 years, and that's happening at winter solstice. And I have heard a description of this conjunction as though it is likened to an annunciation. And so I put up this image of Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Annunciation of Gabriel to Mary, that should she choose to accept, that she will become the mother of the Christ child. I say it that way because I think it's very, very important that we know that she has to express her free will to choose to receive this Annunciation. It's not just a given, she's not dictated to, but an Annunciation is made and she has to receive it. And actually, Rudolf Steiner made a very beautiful prayer for expectant mothers out of Mary's acceptance of this annunciation from the Archangel Gabriel. But what I think is interesting, if we can hold it in our imagination, that when Venus is unveiled on December 14th, I would imagine that she's in this kind of unveiled state until her next meeting with the sun, which comes on March 25th in 2021, maybe the 25th or the 26th, which is actually the Feast of the Annunciation. So Venus is also kind of holding this imagination of this narrative. But now we are in a time where it's not that the spiritual world is going to announce something to us. It is we who must make an annunciation to the spiritual world. And if we're making an annunciation to the spiritual world in the context of the legend of Parzival, which has been made analogous to being on a striving path through anthroposophy, then that thing which we would announce, the thing that wants to rise up, and I really want to, I feel like I'm speaking very fast about this, but it's a very sacred recognition to come to, is that what the human being would announce to the spiritual world is the recognition that I am my brother's keeper. And so that this is what ultimately would be learned out of this striving, out of this gift that has come toward us from the spiritual world, out of recognizing the starry name that is written in the starry script, and recognizing that we have a piece of this knowledge, but that when we come together in community, we can find the wholeness. It's as though the sword is welded together. And now out of that sense, out of recognizing that I have the foundation living within my own heart, that I can then speak to this mystery as Parzival eventually does, where he recognizes what he must do in order to relieve the suffering of the king, to relieve the suffering of the other, to ask what ails thee, and to make the commitment to know that I am my brother's keeper. So with that big buildup, I also wanted to just give a little bit more attention to the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, because I think it figures pretty significantly in what's happening here in 2020. And again, you could say for the next 20 years until the next conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. So winter solstice is going to occur at 5:02 a.m. in the Eastern time zone on December 21st. And then the sun is going to set at 4:49 p.m. So remember, it's solstice, shortest day of the year, so the sun is setting really early. Jupiter is going to set just over 2.5, 3 hours later. And then Jupiter just a minute after, I'm putting up Saturn, but I'm saying Jupiter. So Jupiter will set at 7:21 in the Eastern time zone, and then Saturn will set at 7:22. So you want to be looking for these two at their closest approach to one another between that time from sunset on winter solstice until they set. So between, if you're in the Eastern time zone, from 4:49 to 7:20 p.m., that's the time to be looking for them. According to the folks at Michigan State University, Saturn and Jupiter are going to be closer to one another at this particular conjunction than they have been since the time of Galileo in the 1600s. So it may not look like they're right on top of each other to the naked eye. I mean, they'll be very, very close. Jupiter is much, much brighter than Saturn is. But just to give yourself an orientation, this is just over a month away. So you want to get your viewing spot now and get ready for seeing this. And we're going to see Saturn and Jupiter getting closer and closer to one another from here on in. So you don't have to wait until the 21st to look for it. Get yourself familiar with where they are in the sky. But then, from the setting of Saturn and Jupiter at 7:20 until 2:46 in the morning, again, Eastern time zone, Mars is going to be the only planet in the sky. So now we're imagining that Mars is Parzival. He has heard his name. He has received the sword. He has been told that he didn't ask the question. And so when he starts to turn direct this Friday, he's now making this commitment to take up his task to encounter those things, right those wrongs that you could say that were made out of his unconsciousness. And now Venus is going to be unveiled. Solstice is going to happen. The sun will set. Saturn and Jupiter come together. And then there is Mars as though standing alone in the sky as Parzival, making, I would say, this annunciation, making a commitment to saying, I am my brother's keeper. I can be aware that unless I can sense and feel and help in the suffering of another, this path doesn't get fulfilled. So Also, though, Mars is alone in the sky, but once Mars sets and Venus will then rise at 6:29 a.m., the star Sirius is going to be the greatest light overhead in the sky. So Sirius has been likened to the resting place of the soul of Isis, but also if we imagine the part of the Parzival legend where there's the description of the hound Gardavias, which actually comes from Titurel. It's not in the legend of Parzival. There's a reference to it. But you could imagine that this hound is Canis Major, the big dog, which was the brightest star there is Sirius. And so it's kind of this witness of, or it carries the starry script. And it's a little awkward to say it that way, but what I'm looking for is an imagination that is analogous to this legend. And I don't want to force it, I don't want to force it too much, but I just want to suggest to us that this gesturing back and forth between the planets and the setup, we can find it in these legends. And it's perhaps this is what was being talked about when you see Mars very close, beaming very, very red and bright, and Aries as the Grail castle is not far away, and Venus is standing opposite, cradled in the crescent moon, as though this is the chalice and the host, or the body and the blood of the Christ being in the lap of the feminine, or it's Saguna with Shanatalander, and that we have this kind of cosmic memory of Saturn coming close to the cosmic thought of Jupiter, that there's a moment in there where there's an enunciation of something. We're coming to the stillest point of the year, and Mars is now going direct, and it's waning in brightness for us, but still it's this really awesome picture that starts to build. And then to read what Rudolf Steiner says in Occult Science about how anthroposophy is a grail path, it seems like this is an essential piece of the puzzle right now. At least I'm feeling that way. Okay, so there's a picture of how to find Sirius. If you have never seen Sirius in the night sky, you look for the constellation Orion. Orion is very distinguishable with the 3 stars that mark his belt. And if you follow those stars down to the left, they point to Sirius. It will be the brightest object in that region of the sky. It's the brightest star in our nighttime sky. All right. So that brings me then to the comet Erasmus, which I said on Friday, when Mars is resuming its direct motion, Erasmus is going to be in the region of the constellation Crater, the cup, or the chalice. But then on December 31st, Erasmus is going to be in this constellation Scutum. Now, Scutum is a constellation that comes on board much later. We had 48 original constellations that belong to more ancient times, but then in the 1600s, in the age of exploration, there are 40 constellations that stick from that time. And these are constellations that are not necessarily named according to legend or the idea that the human being incarnates from a particular star. But this constellation, which was named by Johannes Hevelius, Scutum means shield. So the comet Erasmus, which is with the chalice, on this Friday, at the end of this year, on December 31st, is going to be in the region of the shield. So I just think that gives a very interesting accent mark to this whole narrative, particularly because in the Chinese tradition, that region of Scutum, which is shown here as a shield with a cross on it, was known as Tianpian, which meant the heavenly casque or the helmet. So you can imagine that we've got the chalice both with the crescent moon, but also with Erasmus near the constellation Crater, the cup. And now with Erasmus going through Scutum, we have either the shield or the helmet, and each of us would be they who bear the sword. And so I'm just kind of trying to look at, is this a story that's being scripted across the sky right now? It's only there if we see it. I'm not saying that this is definitively how it is, but inviting us to an imagination during this time when it's so easy to be distracted by the drama of what's going on, at least in the United States, around the political election, and you know what I mean. But that there's this awesome narrative that's happening that is kind of calling to us to rise up and say, I am the one, I am she who would care for my brother and for my sister. I recognize that I have a piece of this sword, and that there is this protection, this shield maybe I wear the helmet, but also I have, most importantly, this foundation of anthroposophy in my heart. And out of that, something can come into the world that would not otherwise be available to humanity unless I bear it. So now to our third cascade. I just want to check the time. Okay. So third and final time that you're going to be asked to put something into the chat. So the first time was spirit recalling, which was my way of saying we're going to look into the past and share how did I come first to anthroposophy, or how did I make it to know when it was my path. Second was spirit sensing. What am I doing with anthroposophy in the world and in my life now? And now the third would be spirit beholding and looking forward. What do I hope for here? What do I hope can come out of this, having encountered this source of inspiration that has been laid into my heart, that I can sense in the environment around me? And what do I intend? And this might be a hard question to answer on the spot, but just as an exercise right now, we could do it. And then maybe you could take this and think about it privately, or carry it forward away from this time and really kind of contemplate, what is it that I can do with anthroposophy, or I am doing with anthroposophy, that goes into the future. So I have to get out of share screen so that I can participate as well. So if everybody would take a moment for that. So we did these three cascades: the spirit recalling, how I got here, which is looking into the past; spirit sensing, what I do here, which is kind of being aware of myself in the present; and then spirit beholding, which would be looking toward the future and what I hope for out of anthroposophy. And now, for those of us who chose to participate in this part, we're going to break out into rooms where there will be 4 of us each. We'll have about 3 minutes each to share any part of this, spirit recalling, spirit sensing, or spirit beholding, with one another. And somebody will have to be the timekeeper to make sure that everybody stays on task. I'm going to assume that most of us were familiar with where I got those assignments on the spirit sensing, spirit recalling, spirit sensing, and spirit beholding from the first three panels of the Foundation Stone meditation. But then also, I am very much interested in expressing over and over and over again my experience of the Foundation Stone as occurring in 5 panels. Usually I hear of it referred to as being 4 panels, where the 4th and 5th panel are put into one. But the reason I think this is significant is because we live in what's described as the 5th post-Atlantean epoch, when the human being begins to speak, and we begin to know that we are speaking to the stars. This is awakening. The spiritual consciousness begins to awaken, and being able to say something like, I am my brother's keeper, is, in my imagination, connected to this capacity to know that I am speaking to the stars. I am engaged with the spiritual world. My thoughts, my actions, my deeds have consequence there. And so when we look at the Foundation Stone meditation, we can imagine the first 3 panels are related, it's the spiritual world calling to the human soul, and they are placed in space. At the end of each panel, we have this reference to this call being heard by the elemental spirits in east and west and north and south. 3 times we are placed in space. And then in the 4th panel, this experience, this encounter, this call is placed in time, at the turning point of time with the Christ being. And then in the 5th panel, the human being speaks in response. O light divine, O Son of Christ. So this is the first time that now the human being speaks in the Foundation Stone meditation. So there are 5 panels, but then there are also 3 parts to it. So the first part are these calls, the second part is this placement in time, and then the third part has to do with the speaking of the human being. I apologize, I'm just visited by a cat. So I spit that out pretty quickly, but I just want to say that what I was aiming at was getting a sense of this kind of this past, this present, and this future in relationship to the calls from the Foundation Stone meditation. And then here is the shield I was talking about that I discovered on my path when I was just starting to read the Stein book. And that's exactly how I found it. I think it's basically a heat shield that fell off a car that somebody put out there in the woods to use for target practice maybe 20 years ago. I don't know why it was propped up on that tree at that time, but it was an awesome coincidence that has led to a great deal. So my last slide is going to be dedicated to Fred Janney, but before we get there, I just wanted to read this quote from Karl Koenig, which I think is quite lovely and quite fitting. "There is a knighthood of the present age whose members do not ride through the darkness of physical forests as of old, but through the forests of darkened minds. They are armed with spiritual armor, and an inner sun makes them radiant. Out of them shines healing, healing that flows from a knowing of the image of man as a spiritual being. They must create an inner order, inner justice, peace, and conviction in the darkness of our time. They must know they walk with angels."
Mm.
Okay, so this was an image of the picture of the sunset last night. So Fred, I'm not sure what time he crossed, but what was happening as the sun was coming down through those clouds, the beams were radiating down toward the lake. And then at a certain moment, it slipped behind the cloud, and then the rays shot up. And so it was this kind of uprising in dying. I have heard this described, and that this streaming upward as the sun is setting seemed a very poetic gesture, as something coming to fulfillment and the light of it radiating up. And this is an image of Fred from a few years ago. In 2016, he was very involved in doing work on the expulsions that happened in the Anthroposophical Society in 1935. And he titled his talk, Anthroposophical Society, What Ails Thee?
It was the Parzival question.
Yes, the Parzival question.
Yeah.
And he and I had an opportunity to travel together to Ottawa in 2016. So even though many of us on the call get to have time together, it's not often that you get to spend that dedicated time alone together for many hours and many miles in the car driving. And we had great, wonderful conversation about this topic all the way over to Ottawa. So I just wanted to honor the shining light that Fred has been in the world, and the inner radiance that now becomes available to us having known him. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. An amazing presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for saying so, Burley. If anybody has questions if you need to get off now and you need to get a hold of me, there's my email address, starmare.adams@gmail.com. And you can also visit my website, which is storytellersnightsky.com. This is a very hard medium in which to share this kind of information.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
It has reached a lot of us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Mary, I love the way that you brought the story into our present life. It's so beautiful the way you've associated the Parzival story and the current events in the heavens. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for being there. I in fact tried to email you about this the other day.
Sorry, I didn't respond.
No, you did respond, but you were going off to do something else. But it's just this, I think it's really important for me to kind of say, is this a story? Is this what I'm seeing?
Yes.
It was so magnificent. We get a lot of cloudy skies in Michigan, but the morning that Mars came close, there was Mars in the west. Pisces had leaned over, Aries was right above it, and then in the east there was the moon and Venus. It was with Orion and Sirius. The whole thing was just written across the sky. You couldn't not see it.
That's wonderful. How wonderful.
Yeah, and it keeps going. So
it
thank
sure
you.
Does.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks
Beautiful.
so much.
Beautiful job.
Thanks.
Mary, you
So Mary, I want to say, oh, go ahead.
Okay. Someone else? I was going to say, Mary, you so beautifully clarified our task, our work. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think.
No, I was going to underscore what Linda said, but that tonight I felt that task very strongly with community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the ultimate, I think. but I
Thanks
saw.
for saying so, Katie. Yeah, because trying to get us to community when we're not all together, and actually to try to use the foundation stone meditation, to actually make use of it as this is a tool. It's structure. I mean, I tried even to think, could we do a program that was structured in 5 parts, so that there's these 3 cascading moments, then the 4th where we talk together, which is the turn, and now we all have the sword ideally, and we go out into the world. That's the 5th. This is the human being acting, right? So this was in my imagination behind how to do this, and then also to take that structure and fill it content-wise with this legend of Parzival, but also with this starry script, the imagination of what that is. So that was kind of deeply in the background for me. And this is where I will struggle after we're done, where it's like, did it happen? Did it come together? Can I get big enough for that to fully have lived?
And repetitive enough.
Yeah.
You suggested in the beginning that we find an exercise to hold ourselves together that takes a rhythm of some sort.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm going to mull on.
Okay. Thanks, Katie.
Okay.
Well, Mary, I would like to share that I love how you wove everything together so beautifully and seamlessly and have inspired me deeply. I live in Chicago, where it's very seldom I can see the stars because there's so much light pollution. But I do go to the beach every morning before sunrise, for the sunrise, and I see stars, and I don't really know what's going on there. And just what you did tonight has really awakened so much for me, because I can visualize these things that I'm seeing, but I didn't have a name. And now this beautiful metaphor of Parzival and our tasks and community coming together as pieces of the sword. I mean, I'm going to take away so many beautiful things to carry forward just from this one evening. So thank you, bless you, appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for that. It's really, that's part of what I typed into the chat of what do I hope for from here, which is to increase our awareness of our connection with the stars. And part of that work includes the activity in our communities around issues like light pollution, because we are being cut off systematically from a source of inspiration and a source of life. And it's very difficult to not have that regularly. But I think particularly in our light polluted environments, it's really important when you go out of your way to see whatever stars you can, and particularly if when it's not because you know what it is, but to be a witness to the stars in a place where it's light polluted, that is just so awesome. I have a daughter that lives in New York, and when I go visit her once upon a time before 2020, I would always make sure when we were walking maybe through Greenwich Village, I would stop to look and see whatever stars I could see, because not only are we bereft of seeing the stars, but the earth is not receiving the starlight in that spot. And I feel like trying to witness whatever starlight I can helps it come to the earth so it's not cut off from its own environment. So thank you for getting out to see it.
Yes, and now I will take that with me too. It's almost a responsibility to bring it in.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can see the moon during the day. And just a few days ago, I saw the sickle moon, and it's now it will mean even more to me after tonight's talk. I've always preferred the very thin moon to any of the other aspects. And how you say there's the Grail.
Yeah, so it's a really beautiful, the description that Rudolf Steiner gives. I think it's the 5th lecture in the Christ in the Spiritual World, the Search for the Holy Grail. And I love it, those few times when he gets really intimate in his personal description of how he arrived at something through his spiritual research. And I hesitated to just excerpt a little piece of it because there's such a beautiful build-up to the moment that he reveals where he found the name of Parzival and how he did it. And I've also allowed myself to imagine that he doesn't say this, but who is it, or what being is it that is saying to him, you must look for the name of Parzival, you must figure out where that is. And I allow myself to imagine that it's Siguna. I'm just going to leave that there. There's a whole bunch going on there, but just that she is the one that is, you have to know where that name is.
I think there's a passage somewhere where he says that's the Norwegian folk spirit.
Aha, he does. Okay, so I've learned, taken a note of that.
Well, I can tell you, for me, I don't know if anybody remembers Mission Impossible. It was on TV, or if you looked at it or not. But there's a point in the beginning where all you see is a match, and it's strict, and they light that fuse. I've been relit from this here thing right here that you have done. I got my armor is polished. I got my sword ready, and I'm heading tonight to Grail Castle. I will not only save the king because I am God in my own head, I will save the queen and every damn gone thing up in there. I am telling you, this was off the charts. I am so high right now. I think I'm already in Venus. So I am excited, and I'm ready. I'm ready for the battle. And, ready for the battle up here. Where my brothers and sisters are stuck, a lot of them. But girlfriend, I bow.
Thank you.
You're off the charts. That's all I got to say. Every time I see you, it's like you hit that mark. Shoom, you don't miss nothing. If I was your children must be wonderful, Cole. I don't think they got away with nothing. So thank you so much. And I'm going to go now and start. I got my book here. I got the other book. Now I can go to chapter 16 because you helped me remember. Thank you very much. I am here. I got Merlin, the king, the 12, all of it now. Makes perfect sense. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Desi. Thank you so much.
And I keep the sign think around me all the time. So I appreciate you, girlfriend. I'm telling you. I'm going to sing you a song called Use Me, because that's what you were talking about, that God has to use each one of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Raised his hand, I think, or said goodbye. I'm not sure which one.
Well, I'll hang out to the end. So
okay.
If anybody wants to talk or say anything.
Hi, Mary. It's Nicolette. We met at
yes, out west, out in
west.
Yes.
Yeah. When our way, that was really awesome. Yeah. I don't want to take up any airtime, but thank you. But I've never been so drawn to the skies as recently, and every time I've been seeing Mars, it's like, how come I've never seen you before and noticed you? And it's like, it's been like my really, I call the moon, my moon, my grandchildren know that, but Mars has sort of become a sidekick. And sort of sad, or not sad, but there's this recognition, and to be able to bring this this story and this first call and then a second call, it's incredible. So there's a lot to work with there. And even though you went very fast, I think it was well received. It was heard.
Yeah. Mars is definitely going. Psst.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to add one more thing, is we're all talking about going to see the night skies, but bring the children. The children need someone to show them, and they are so hungry and longing for it. And I'm just noticing it with my grandchildren, but when you watch them watching the sky, you can get this sense of this soul that's coming back and saying, I know something here, and I tell my grandchildren all the time that they know, and that as they grow older, they will forget, right? So please tell me what you know already. And it's amazing what they tell me.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining in.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Mary, look what I have.
I see you got the Foundation Stone Meditation by none other than Patricia DeLisa.
Yes, Mary and her sister did up this beautiful version of the foundation.
I have to correct you as much as I would like to take credit. My sister Patricia did that.
The entire
thing. It was her inspiration to create. So it's the Foundation Stone Meditation on a pentagon, and it folds up. It's really beautiful.
It is really beautiful.
Yeah.
Where do we get one?
Yes.
Let's see. Pat is here, but I'm not sure that she can speak because she's having audio challenges with her computer. But if you email me, I will get you in touch with her. They were all handmade. So they're not sitting around on a stock shelf somewhere.
Did in this really beautiful little sleeve.
Also, Christoph and Robin have their hand.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hello, Miss Mary. And every time I talk to you, I always want to know something new to read. And you've gotten me into the fairy tale book.
There was a good fairy tale. Darn it! The Prince Who Feared Nothing.
Okay,
Brothers
that
Grimm.
wasn't what I was going to ask, but
But there it is.
The Prince.
It's a really good Parzival. It's the Prince Who Feared Nothing. And there's a sword in it, and he's got to break the spell, and he's got, it's really good.
Do you happen to remember which color of book it's in?
No, it's a Brothers Grimm.
It's a Grimm. Oh, I've got some of those. Okay. The question I wanted to ask tonight, though, is I've been on multiple ones of your contemplations and your presentations, and they're all beautiful. Tonight, again, you used a verse from Karl Koenig.
Uh-huh.
And Karl Koenig has quite a few different books. So if you had to pick your favorite one with some of the verses you relate to the most, which one would it be? Because I'm getting ready to do an order for Christmas.
I would, okay, so it's not a verse book, but the book of his that's been the most important in my life is The Mystery of John.
Okay.
And there's a subtitle, but I can't remember what it is. And he gave lectures every year at the Feast of St. John to the Camp Hill community. They're wonderful, wonderful lectures. And it's in that book where he discusses the birth of the new year, or the conception of the new year at the Festival of St. John. But that would take us another 2 hours. So I just wanted to say that that's the book I would recommend for me.
Do you happen to know what book that verse came out of from tonight?
Oh, I don't have it. I thought about it right before I got on. I was like, I didn't, but I will get it and I will share it.
Okay. It was a beautiful verse. That's why I really liked it.
It really is. It really is.
It just kind of struck a chord
perfectly with what we were talking about.
It did. It really did. And thank you so much for getting us connected with this through email so that we could join this. This was beautiful.
Thank you. I'm so glad you were here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good night. Sweet dreams.
Same to you.
Do you have your hand up, Richard, or are you saying goodbye? Oh, you're muted.
Okay. What Parzival would you recommend to read? Because there's
I'm reading Wolfram von Eschenbach.
Yeah, but who is it published by?
Oh, this one is vintage. I bought this at Rudolf Steiner College in 2005. So that was the one that they had there. So it's vintage publishing. The quotes that I read from were not from this text because it's not written in rhyming poetic verse. But I think it's fun when you get one that you're solid with to then look at the other ones. So, and then this book, I highly recommend as well. And also, I really recommend Brian's course on it because it's very rich and very deep. If you want to take a deep dive, do you want me to hold that up so you can see it, Nicolette? Okay. It's a really wonderful, really wonderful He takes us through each adventure, each book, and how it's related to the constellations of the zodiac, and how you can read that in the activity that's taking place.
How do we find out about Brian Gray's course? Just Google?
I found it through Wise Cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
Wise Cosmos is hosting it. And it's a course that he gave last year with Alice Stam. So there's eurythmy in each session. And because it's recorded, then you can go at your own pace.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Thank you. Thank
I
you.
wanted to say thank you, Mary, so much. Greetings from Arizona.
Oh, thanks for being here, Arizona.
So I recently just became a member, and I'm so excited. And it was just so rich and so full of so many nuggets of goodness. So anyway, thank you